ecologists not only analyze the ecosystems on land, but they even analyze aquatic ecosystems, the ecosystems where there's water. So they analyze the ecosystems in rivers and in streams and in estuaries and bays and the ocean. If one's really interested in that, you can take a course in either ecology or oceanography so that you can learn more about ecosystems. Now the next thing that's listed here, mountain zonation. And this is a concept all of us are familiar with, even if you don't recognize my description, mountain zonation. Let's take a look, as I wrote on page I-4. And on page I-4, I want to look at the lower bottom left, the bottom left on page I-4. And here's what we're describing. If you were to either hike up a mountain, or preferably drive up a mountain, right, on a highway, you would see that the higher up you went, the cooler it got. In other words, the climate changes. And as the climate changes, the higher up in altitude you go, the type of plants and the type of animals would change. In other words, the ecosystem would change. So that's why those of us who've driven up, driven up to Mount Baldy, you've driven up to Lake Arrowhead or Big Bear. So when you drive up to these at higher elevation, you will literally feel that it gets cooler and cooler. On the top of the mountains, that's where they get the snow. And the ecosystems change, and literally you will see the type of vegetation change so that when you get near the top of Lake Arrowhead and so on, Big Bear, you're surrounded by pine trees and spruce and fir. You're in a subarctic zone. You're in a subarctic zone, a coniferous forest. And at the very top of the mountains is a tundra, because it's basically a snow peak, snow cap. So if you have trouble traveling geographically, if it's been difficult to travel up to British Columbia and you would like to see what's the ecosystem in British Columbia without having to travel as far, just drive up a mountain and you will get to the same kind of ecosystem that you would find in British Columbia, in the subarctic zone, higher up on the mountain. I can visualize a mountain in the middle of a tropical zone, where at the foot of the mountain is a tropical ecosystem, and literally as you go up that mountain, you go from a tropical ecosystem to a temperate ecosystem to a subarctic ecosystem to an arctic ecosystem. An example of what I'm thinking, what I have in mind, is Mount Kilimanjaro. Mount Kilimanjaro in Kenya, at the foot of it, it's at the base of the tropical zone, and on the top, it's an Arctic zone. So literally you would go through the different sun zones just as if you had traveled from the equator north or south. You get the same effect going altitudinally higher in altitude. So back on page I-2, this was called mountain zonation. Now we've already talked about the human implications of human population size based on how high up on the food chain we eat. So the next thing I want to address is something called bioaccumulation, or biological magnification of non-degradable substances. The first thing I've written is that most potentially toxic substances, and we first think, what's toxic? Toxic means poisonous. Most potentially toxic or poisonous substances, fortunately, can be metabolized by living organisms. Metabolized means broken down. So the vast majority of potentially harmful or toxic substances that living things are exposed to, they can fortunately break down or metabolize most of them. Now we might ask, where in our body, where in a human's body do we break down toxic substances? And the answer is our liver. Our liver, the largest organ in our body, is commonly referred to as our detox organ. It detoxifies or breaks down various substances that we have ingested that might be toxic. It breaks down medicines. Medicines are not necessarily toxic, but our body doesn't know that. So in fact, it breaks down medicine. So if you're taking a medicine, you have to take more of it either later in the day or the next day because your liver breaks down these foreign substances that are introduced to our body. But I just said that most toxic substances can be broken down by our body, but not all toxic substances. For non-degradable toxic substances, and by non-degradable I mean those that cannot be degraded or broken down, such as DDT, we wrote that there will be an increasing concentration of that non-degradable toxic substance as it moves up the food chain. To help us understand what that means, let's look at page I-7. Page I-7. And on the top of page I-7, so in fact, on the top of I-7, it says bioaccumulation of non-degradable substances. Now, let's imagine, here it's basically showing a food chain. And let's imagine, here's a field of corn, and we spray those corn plants with DDT. Now, DDT is an insecticide. We know we spray fields with insecticides because if we didn't, the insects would eat everything there before we even had a chance to harvest it. So and they used to spray fields with DDT. Now in a moment we'll explain that they don't use DDT anymore, but they used to. Anyhow, DDT was sprayed on the corn plant to kill the insects. It's a chemical that cannot be broken down by any living things. So this little bar graph, this graph represents the relative concentration of DDT in that corn plant. We've sprayed the corn plant with this insecticide, so we now have molecules of this insecticide in the plant. Now, right above it, it shows a mouse. There are mice out in the wild. Not all of them are living in people's homes. We said how they end up in a barn or in a home is they come from the out in the fields, and it's nice and warm and cozy inside of a house or a barn, but most of the mice are still out in the wild. And here the mouse is eating the kernels of corn. Every molecule of DDT that's on those corn kernels are now accumulating in the body of this mouse. And that mouse doesn't just eat one or two little pieces of kernels of corn, it eats lots of corn. That's what it lives off of, out of this cornfield. So you'll notice that the concentration of DDT in the tissues in the body of this mouse are at a higher concentration than the DDT in the corn plant. And then it shows a weasel. Weasels are animals that feed on mice out in the wild. So, and that weasel doesn't just eat one mouse, it eats lots of mice. That's what it lives on. Every molecule of DDT in the mice that the weasel eats now accumulates in the body of the weasel. None of these organisms can break down DDT. So you'll notice in this graph, this now represents the concentration of DDT in the weasel. So what do we notice? At each higher level on the food chain, we're getting a higher and higher concentration of this non-degradable toxic substance in the body because none of these organisms can break it down, and so it's getting concentrated. This is known as bioaccumulation or biological magnification of a non-degradable toxic substance. Now, when ecologists saw this pattern in the 1960s, there was a very famous person named Rachel Carlson who wrote a book called Silent Spring describing this biological bioaccumulation of DDT in organisms. And her book mostly focused on how this was potentially becoming more and more toxic to animals that were feeding high on the food chain. Most of her warnings were ignored because most people really didn't care about animals feeding high on the food chain until it was recognized, you know who else eats high on the food chain? We do. And they started measuring higher and higher levels of DDT in the bodies of us humans. And at that point, the Environmental Protection Agency, the US EPA, banned the use of DDT in the United States. So while DDT is still used in other places in the world, it has been banned for use in the United States. We do use insecticides, but the insecticides that are used today are insecticides that can be broken down once we understood this concept of bioaccumulation.
What can the side effects be of a higher concentration?
Well, this is a toxic chemical. It's used to kill insects, but at higher and higher concentrations, it'll kill the organisms higher up on the food chain. So we were starting to see, for example, these higher animals and birds and even humans getting sick from DDT in their body.
And what year did they ban the...
It's in the 1960s. You can Google it. So, all right, so that's what bioaccumulation or biological magnification of non-degradable substances. Now, we want to look at, back on page I2, the photosynthesis-respiration cycle. It is also known as the global carbon cycle. So before I read what's written here, let's show you this photosynthesis-respiration cycle or global carbon cycle by looking again at page I7. So we're going to return right back to the page we were on. And we're focusing our attention on this middle picture on I7. Now, we have learned that plants, of course, carry on photosynthesis to make their own food. They are autotrophs. And in order for plants to carry on photosynthesis, we know they need sunlight, they need water, rainfall, and they take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And I've said the amount of carbon dioxide in the air, in the atmosphere, is the same everywhere in the atmosphere. Let me remind you, air is about 80% nitrogen gas, about 20% oxygen. It's a very, very minute amount of carbon dioxide. You'd say, well, this adds up to 100. Well, it's really not quite 100. That's because nitrogen is really not 80%, it's 79.8%. So, in the 0.2% are all the other chemicals, including carbon dioxide in the air. Anyhow, plants take that carbon dioxide that's in the air and they join the carbon and oxygen of the carbon dioxide molecules with the hydrogen from the water to form sugars, as we've described in photosynthesis. And that, through that, plants are able to form these organic molecules. Now, here it shows a bunny rabbit. The bunny is feeding on these plants. And we know that all living things, plants and animals and all other living things, carry on a process called respiration or cellular respiration. Cellular respiration, we know, is the process of breaking down organic molecules, mostly sugars, but also fats and even proteins, to make ATP. And ATP is what is the gasoline that powers the cells of all living things. So here it's simply showing, it shows an arrow, shows a plant, and it shows that this plant, as they carry on cellular respiration, let's remind ourselves what cellular respiration is. Cellular respiration, and here it's a little bit sloppy, but we've written it before, but here we've reminded you what photosynthesis is. Photosynthesis is when plants use carbon dioxide and water and sunlight to make sugars, and they give off oxygen. Cellular respiration is where, just the reverse process, it's where all living things break down foods, such as sugars, with oxygen, and they break them down into carbon dioxide and water in order to make ATP. So all living things are breaking down organic molecules with oxygen and giving off carbon dioxide. So here it shows with the arrow that the plant is giving off carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, and so are animals. All living things are carrying on respiration, or cellular respiration. Now, if plants do both, Plants carry on both photosynthesis, where they take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and turn them into organic molecules like sugars. And they also break down these organic molecules. They break them back down into carbon dioxide and return the carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. So my first question is this. Plants do both. They do photosynthesis and they do cellular respiration. My question is, does the rate of cellular respiration equal the rate of photosynthesis? Do plants break down the organic molecules into carbon dioxide as fast as they make these organic molecules using carbon dioxide? They actually do more photosynthesis than cellular respiration. Think about this. If the plant makes organic molecules using carbon dioxide by photosynthesis, and then it also breaks down these organic molecules, releasing carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, if it broke down the organic molecules as fast as it made them, then the plants, the trees, would always remain the same size. But we know that all the grasses and shrubs and trees keep growing. We all know we have to trim these plants because they keep growing. So if they're growing, that means they are forming these organic molecules faster than they're breaking them down. This also points out something else. So we know that plants give off oxygen in photosynthesis, but they use up oxygen in cellular respiration. So do plants use up as much oxygen as they make? No, we've just explained that plants do more photosynthesis than they do cellular respiration. So if they produce or give off oxygen during photosynthesis, even though they use oxygen for cellular respiration, since they do more photosynthesis than cellular respiration, they produce more oxygen than they use. So plants are doing more photosynthesis than cellular respiration. That allows them to grow bigger and bigger. Now you might say, but didn't you tell us, Professor Fink, that we stop growing and we stay the same size? We're not plants. We can only grow so tall. But those trees, those just seem to get taller and taller and taller. We're not a plant. Yes, we don't keep growing bigger, we can keep growing wider. But plants can keep growing bigger and bigger and wider and taller. So they obviously grow through an anabolic process of forming organic molecules. Anabolic is growth. Cellular respiration is catabolic. That's breaking down to make ATP. But they carry on more anabolic growth processes by photosynthesis than catabolic processes in the form of cellular respiration. As a result, because plants are always growing, that's why animals can eat them. Because if they weren't growing, if the animal ate them, there'd be nothing left to eat. But it's okay if the bunny rabbit eats some grass or some dandelions, there'll be more grass and more dandelions the next day and the next week, because the plants keep carry on photosynthesis. So all living things, though, carry on cellular respiration. Not only do plants carry on cellular respiration and return carbon dioxide back to the atmosphere, not only do animals break down foods by cellular respiration and return carbon dioxide back to the atmosphere, remember that there is a commonality that is found to all living things. All living things die, be they plant or animal, and we know that there are decomposers in the soil, in the environment, mostly bacteria and fungi, that break down the organic molecules of the dead remains of plants and animals, and they also carry on cellular respiration and return carbon dioxide back to the atmosphere. What we are describing here is what ecologists call the carbon cycle, or the photosynthesis-respiration cycle. One of the major things that ecologists like to analyze are these cycles of various cyclical processes occurring on the planet Earth. So they see one giant pattern or cycle that plants take carbon dioxide from the air and turn them into organic molecules by photosynthesis. And all living things, not only the plants themselves, but animals that feed on plants, and even decomposers that decompose the organic molecules from dead plants and animals, all break down these organic molecules and return the carbon dioxide back to the atmosphere. And that creates or completes one large so-called carbon cycle, or photosynthesis-respiration cycle. But there's one more facet to this I want to mention. For reasons that we don't fully understand, millions of years ago, organisms died and became buried under the earth and were never decomposed. You say, what? So millions of years ago, there were large amounts of organisms that had died, became buried under the earth, and they were never broken down by decomposers. Today, we call these fossil fuels. They include petroleum, another name for oil, and coal. So we've all heard of coal, we've heard of oil. What are they? So we wrote that petroleum or oil are really the fossilized remains of bacteria. Now this is usually where most students will say, but I thought oil is made out of dead dinosaurs. Well, I don't know where you heard it, but it's not right. It's the fossilized remains of huge amounts of bacteria that became buried under the earth. That's what oil is. You'd say, how do we know that? If we analyze the chemical composition of oil, petroleum, it most closely resembles the chemical composition of bacteria. So, millions of years ago, vast amounts of bacteria, probably at a time when mostly all there were a lot of single-celled organisms living in these ancient seas, became buried under the earth because of geological changes, were never decomposed, and that's what what oil or petroleum is. Now, coal is the fossilized remains of plants. You'd say, how do we know that? Well, first off, when you actually dig up coal, sometimes you can even see imprints of fern plants. But furthermore, when we chemically analyze coal, it most closely resembles the chemical composition of plants, especially fern plants. So again, at a later time than the formation of oil deposits, plants became buried under the earth, probably again because of geological cataclysmic changes, became buried under the earth, was never decomposed. All right, so for millions of years, these organic compounds, these organic molecules, the fossilized remains of bacteria and plants remain buried under the earth until the Industrial Revolution. Now, for those of you who've taken a course in history, Industrial Revolution begins in England in about what time?
19th century.
Yeah, in the 19th century, around the 1830s. So around the 1830s, it begins in England where we start when they create an internal combustion engine, and we start feeding these engines organic molecules to power them. The first organic molecules they dug up from the earth to power these engines was coal. So we had steam engines, right? We had steam engines, steam-powered boats. Instead of sailboats, they had steam-powered boats, so they didn't have to rely on the winds and sails. And then we had steam locomotives or trains using coal. And then they found that by the 1860s, they started to find, 1860s and 1880s, oil was almost a better source than coal. So they started switching increasingly to the use of oil and gasoline over even coal. These are called fossil fuels. What does an internal combustion engine do with oil and coal? So I wrote right here that what an internal combustion engine does is it takes the fossil fuels, the organic molecules that are in coal and oil, and after all, what are these? What are these organic molecules in coal and oil? They are the fossilized remains of living things. Those are the organic molecules that made up plants and bacteria. Now, what an internal combustion engine does is it breaks down the coal and oil with oxygen. and it breaks the organic molecules in coal and oil, it breaks it down with oxygen into carbon dioxide and water, releasing energy. Now what I want to draw your attention to is that what I've just written here looks a hell of a lot like cellular respiration, which I wrote just above it. In cellular respiration, that's when living things break down organic molecules such as sugars and fats and proteins with oxygen, and they break them down into carbon dioxide and water to make a form of energy called ATP. So what does a car engine? A car engine is an internal combustion engine. You're feeding it oil, you're feeding it gasoline, you're feeding it the fossilized remains of organic molecules from fossilized bacteria. And we break it down with oxygen in your car engine. Now some of you might be thinking, wait a second, my car engine uses, okay, I knew it used gasoline, oil, I didn't know it used oxygen. It uses oxygen. Have you ever wondered why you need an air filter? Because the engine sucks in air, and it uses the oxygen in the air to combust the gasoline. So if you didn't suck in the air, you couldn't break down the gasoline. So it uses oxygen, and we just pass the air through a filter before that air enters the engine, and the oxygen combusts or ignites with the fossil fuels. And the major chemicals that come out the exhaust pipe of a car are carbon dioxide and water. And it releases energy, and that energy is used to make your car, your wheels turn so that your car moves forward. It also gives off a lot of heat, as predicted by the second law of thermodynamics. That's why your car engine gets so hot. All right, so here's the point we're making. Beginning in the 1830s, accelerating into the 1860s and 1880s, and accelerating at a faster and faster rate over this beginning of the 20th century and accelerating more in the 21st century. So we've been breaking down these fossil fuels in our cars and other internal combustion engines, and what do we say they're broken down into? Carbon dioxide. So this has been releasing more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere as these fossil fuels are combusted and broken apart, releasing carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So we have seen that even though the amount of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere is very small, it has been increasing. But this adds one other facet we need to add. It was discovered in the 1960s and 70s that increasing the amount of carbon dioxide in the air or atmosphere traps solar heat. And our first thought is, what's solar heat? Solar means from the sun. So increasing amounts of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere cause the atmosphere to retain more heat from the sun. So this phenomenon where increasing warming of the earth or atmosphere associated with increasing amounts of CO2 in the air is known as global warming. Or the original effect was studied in greenhouses, and it was known as the greenhouse effect. Or global warming is the way it's usually referred to today. Now, of course, this whole subject gets somewhat controversial. There's certain things that really almost everybody agrees on, and there's certain things where there's a degree of disagreement among researchers and scientists. What we know for sure really cannot be disputed is that the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is increasing. Why is it increasing? Because for millions of years, these fossil fuels or organic molecules remain buried under the earth, but increasingly we have been digging up oil and coal out of the ground and burning them in our internal combustion engines, such as our car engines, which release carbon dioxide out the exhaust pipes. And obviously, if you went back a generation ago, each family used to have one car. Today, every adult has a car. So the number of cars is just increasing exponentially. And so the amount of release of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has been increasing. We also know, and it really can't be disputed, is that the overall average temperature of the atmosphere has been increasing. Not by a lot, maybe by 1/2 degree is all. But it has been rising. There's enough evidence that really cannot be disputed. Where the arguments are is the following. We do know that even before there ever were cars, before there ever were people, there were changes in our climate. There had been ice ages and hot periods before there ever were people or ever were cars. So we do know that there is natural cycles and natural patterns that can occur independently of anything we humans do. Nevertheless, there's many people who believe that this increasing combustion of fossil fuels is the major cause of current global warming. My particular position is I really don't know whether the increasing temperature of our planet, which is real, is part of a natural cycle or whether it's actually due to increased use of fossil fuels. I'm not sure. And I don't think that anybody knows with certainty. But what I would suggest, or what I do believe is, since we don't know one way or the other for sure, the safest thing is we ought to be careful. Because if we are the cause of this change in temperature, then we're going to make it worse. We may not end up being the cause, but probably a cautious and a prudent approach would be to consider that we could be a cause, or we could be at least a factor, and so we want to affect what's going on as little as possible, even though there still may be natural cycles that exist that may be occurring independently of anything that we as humans do. Let's return back to page I2. So on page I2, we've been talking about combustion of fossil fuels. We've spoken of the release of carbon dioxide through combustion of fossil fuels and the greenhouse effect and thus increasing heat or temperature. Whenever fossil fuels are broken apart with oxygen, they primarily release, as we've said, carbon dioxide and water out the exhaust. But anytime there is insufficient amounts of oxygen mixed with the fossil fuel, that increases the amount of carbon monoxide gas that comes out the exhaust. Now, carbon monoxide is, without a doubt, the most toxic and lethal of all the contaminants or pollutants released from combustion. Carbon monoxide binds irreversibly with the hemoglobin in our red blood cells, poisoning the red blood cells and preventing red blood cells from transporting oxygen in our bloodstream. This is known as carbon monoxide poisoning. So one of the things they checked for when they do your smog tests, smog pollution tests on your car, is they stick the probe up the exhaust pipe and they measure the amount of carbon monoxide coming out the exhaust pipe. That's the most toxic of all the air pollutants. But again, it's not the last one. Another chemical that is found in all fossil fuels, both coal and oil, is sulfur. And if you're wondering why would sulfur be found in fossil fuels, why would it be found in coal, why would it be found in oil, we had learned that 6 major elements that make up most of the chemicals in living things are SNOPs: carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and sulfur. So since sulfur is an element found in living things, it's also found in the fossilized remains of living things, such as coal and oil. So when fossil fuels are burned, when coal and oil are burned with oxygen, some of that sulfur combines with oxygen and is released as sulfur dioxide. Sulfur dioxide is especially irritating to our eyes, and is the chemical pollutant in smog that really irritates our eyes. The fact that anytime you go past an oil refinery and you smell that smell of kind of rotten eggs, that's hydrogen sulfide, that's sulfur-containing chemicals that are being released from the oil refinery. So we see that there are many air pollutants. There's the release of carbon dioxide, which may be contributing to global warming. There's the release of carbon monoxide, which can poison our red blood cells. There is a release of sulfur dioxide, which irritates the eyes with smog. The last topic that I want to address in terms of ecosystems is the water cycle. Everybody's familiar with the water cycle. Let's take a look at page I-8. Page I-8. This is page I-8. Everybody is familiar with the water cycle. What happens is the clouds appear overhead. The clouds rain and snow. And as the snow and rain fall upon the earth, eventually the snow melts. The rain trickles down, it forms streams, it forms rivers, it flows into lakes, and eventually most of that water that fell onto the landscape eventually makes its way out to the ocean. And there, under the heat of the sun, the water in the ocean, as well as the rivers and lakes, evaporates. And as this water evaporates, it changes from liquid water to water vapor and forms clouds. And then these clouds of water vapor are carried by the wind, and eventually they drop that water vapor. The water vapor condenses, and condensation of water vapor simply means that the water vapor changes into liquid water or solid water and falls as either rain or snow right back onto the land. So we see that the water that falls as rain and snow onto the land is really the same water that has been falling upon the mountainsides and so on for thousands and millions of years. It just keeps cycling. The water falls, it trickles down, makes its way out to rivers and lakes and the ocean. It evaporates, forming clouds, and then the water condenses in the clouds and falls again as rain and snow. This is known as nature's water cycle, and it just keeps cycling over and over and over.